Hello and welcome to this episode of Catching the Octopus podcast. Last episode, we spoke about representation and about how we can become what we repeatedly see, or how that affects what we think we can become and what that brings about within different people, whether they think and see representation of good and whether that incites that within them, or whether they see representation of not so cool stuff, which then gives people permission to come out of the shadows, right, in that area. And we explored why it matters that, children see doctors who look like them, and why it matters when kindness is celebrated, and why it also matters when hatred or violence or division are repeatedly rewarded. But after recording that episode, I sort of was querying a little bit more and sitting in some reflection, and I thought about the elements of why that representation has so much power. And I wanted to go a bit deeper on that in this episode, in looking at, why can one repeated message slowly change an entire culture, and why a single lie repeated enough can often begin to feel like truth. So today, going deeper in that, I'm going to explore a little bit of psychology behind all that works, and perhaps even some energy stuff sprinkled in there too, and just go a little bit deeper. So when we look at the brain, right, the brain is not looking for truth. This is one of the most fascinating discoveries in psychology. We like to think we're rational and that we carefully evaluate evidence around us and that we're objective and all those kinds of things. But much and most of the time, our brain isn't actually asking, is this true? It's actually asking, is this familiar? And so when something is familiar, it saves the energy and that we need to use when processing information. It also keeps us safe. As I said, that what is familiar is safe to the brain, because then we understand it and we know it. And even if what is familiar can pose risk to us, it's still less risk than something that's unfamiliar. So familiarity also then, when we look at that, it helps us predict the future. And that's kind of where the safety element sits, right? And our brains evolved to recognize patterns. And they recognize patterns long before they evolved to debate any philosophy elements, right? And that means repetition has extraordinary power in how our brains function, what they store, and what belief systems they create. So let's look at it this way as an example. When you go to buy a new car, or maybe you're thinking about buying one and you're looking at different vehicles and one kind of sticks out for you, then when you're driving around, you see that car everywhere, right? Exact car. And you're just like, wow, everyone's got the same car that I looked. But they didn't, obviously. They didn't all, it's not everyone's got one. They didn't just go buy one overnight, right? Those cars were always there. But because your brain was thinking about the car and then it decided, oh, this is important now, it then started seeing more of it. Now, this is what in psychology and in neuroscience and those sorts of things is referred to as the reticular activating system. So the reticular activating system is the filter that sits at the base of your brain that decides what is actually going to reach your conscious awareness. So every second that we're around, millions of pieces of information, right, are competing for your attention. And the brain filters so much of them out and only lets what's important actually come through. Now, if you think of your social media feed, if you think about the news, if you think about politics, think about outrage, what happens if your brain starts tagging that, or tagging things like anger as important? When it does that, then obviously that's all you're going to notice. There also is another neuroscience principle, which is neurons that fire together, wire together. So that came from Donald Hebb. And he proposed this thing saying that every repeated thought strengthens a pathway in our brain. And so this is where we say, repetitive stuff, repetition is the master of all skill by TR. Looking at the more we do something, the more natural it becomes. So if you think of it like walking through maybe long grass, if the first time you did that, it might have been a bit tricky, but after the 100th time, you've got a track, right? A well-worn track. And so that same thing happens in our brain. The more we start thinking about something, the easier it becomes to think of it again. And so this is where the positive affirmations, with journaling, positive stuff, with repeating positive self-talk, all of those sorts of things are really important for wiring the brain for what you want. Acts of gratitude as well included in there. And so this is true whether the thought is helpful or harmful. And this is why I talk so much about focusing on the helpful parts of what we can put in our brain. But if we're looking at the element, it doesn't matter if it's helpful or harmful, because if you're always looking at fear and what is there to fear, then fear strengthens. If you're in a space of compassion and you're always doing acts of compassion and thinking about that, that strengthens. Judgment strengthens. Gratitude strengthens. So our brain simply is wired to strengthen whatever we repeatedly practice. And even with meditation, I usually tell people, if you're going to meditate, try and meditate in the same spot, hopefully at the same time, with the same routine every time. Because as you go to do that, the brain kind of goes, oh, we're doing this now, are we? And it just becomes second nature. And it makes the meditation easier every time you do it. You get to go deeper and have different experiences, right? So, as well as the brain, our nervous system also picks up on things, right? So, our nervous system can notice things before we even notice them, whether that be patterns or whether that even be emotions or vibrations and frequency. So, when we are out and about, though, or even as individuals, our emotions aren't contained within us, even if we think they are. They actually vibrate out, right? They have a frequency that vibrates out. And so, a good example of noticing that is if you've ever walked into a room and you've immediately sensed the tension, right? No one's spoken, no one's moving or doing anything, but you can feel it and you're just like, what's going on in here? Or, maybe you've spent time with someone who laughs easily and before long you're laughing too, and that becomes contagious, right? So our nervous systems are constantly communicating with each other. And psychologists refer to this as emotional contagion. So we're wired to co-regulate. It's one of the reasons why communities mean so much, and why I'm a big advocate of we're all the same species, right? This is the same. It's a commonality between every human and even some other animals as well, right? You can sense when animals are sad or upset or frustrated or angry, sometimes without even seeing them. You just get that feeling because and so we build these communities, and the reason why communities are so important is because they can help us regulate, right? The people around us literally influence how our nervous system functions. Now, I take this a little bit deeper as well. I often talk about you are the sum of the 5 people that you surround yourself with. So when I talk about that, I'm looking at that from a whole range of different levels, from mental well-being, from emotional regulation, even financial standing. So if I was to speak to 4 people that you regularly spend your time with, I could confidently predict very closely who you are. If I was checking with them, their mental capabilities or their mental wellness space, I could predict that in you. Their financial element, whatever their average is probably what you are. If I looked at what was the emotional capability and regulation, if I looked at that, I could probably gather where you are. So this sort of stuff is contagious and it comes out. And this is where I get concerned when there's representation that's creating different communities, because then it becomes an echo chamber of just all that unhelpful, uncool stuff. And why I have said, especially in some of my park chats, how I try to curate my social space or my tech space on what my feed actually shows me and what I engage in, because I don't want to engage in things, one, to push the algorithm out and say that things are more important and should be shared, that I don't want to see or I don't think people should be watching or sharing because of the adverse effects it can have. But also, too, I want to create a positive echo chamber. I want to keep my brain looking at the good things in life. I want to keep it motivated. I want to keep it kind. I want to keep it looking at how do we build community and looking out for each other. And so I'm very careful of how I curate my feed and try and train my algorithm to do that. So if we're talking about algorithms, a good little segue, right, is to moving into how that is learnt as well, right? So when we're looking at an algorithm, it's not checking posts and things and going, oh, is this healthy and is this a good thing to be sharing, right? It's pretty much asking, will this keep people engaged? Will this incite engagement? Right? Because the more engagement that incites, the more it thinks that it's popular, the more that it keeps sending stuff out. But the thing is, there's a lot of things that can engage people, right? Fear keeps us engaged. Conflict is another thing that keeps us engaged. Outrage is a thing that keeps us engaged. And so that means that fear and conflict and outrage, they're getting rewarded. Right? And eventually our brains begin believing that those things are normal because we're seeing them all the time. And also with our brain, it does the same thing as what algorithms do. The more that we keep feeding it, the more that it actually sees that, oh, this is truth. Like we said before, the brain doesn't know what's true and what's not. So whatever you're feeding into it is what becomes its reality, right? So eventually our brains begin believing that all of those things are just normal. Having fear, conflict, outrage, that is a normal way of being. And the the other element side to that is the way that the brain doesn't know what's truth and what's not is a thing called the illusion of truth, right? And this is really cool. But research has consistently shown that simply hearing something repeatedly, more than once, over and over, makes us more likely to believe it, right? Even if it's false. So it's not always the case in all people, because some people are critical thinkers and they like to fact check and they like to do all those sorts of things. But it happens frequently enough within people that it's a concern to psychologists, right? And they refer to it as the illusionary truth effect. So repetition creates familiarity. We mentioned that before. Familiarity creates comfort or safety. Right? We all understand that. And sometimes that comfort and safety is often mistaken for truth. So if we look at something maybe like advertising, right? Political slogans, even theories on different things, if that is repeated often enough, then the brain starts lowering the guard, right? And so the brain will then start going, oh, maybe there's some truth in that because I've been told that enough. So if we go to our own self-talk, this happens a fair bit. People that tend to maybe have lower self-esteem or don't have as much confidence, if you ask them what their self-talk was, I am 100% can guarantee to you that they berate themselves in their minds, they call themselves names in their minds, and they do a whole range of other stuff that isn't conducive to supporting their mental well-being. And so this is that thing that it isn't true. They may not be stupid, but they're calling themselves stupid. And the brain goes, oh, okay, we're stupid, are we? Right? So they won't try new things that might show them that they're smart or that might actually contradict this story that the brain has created. If you're constantly telling them that they're a horrible partner, then the brain's going to go, oh, you're a horrible partner. So their standards are going to be lower because they don't think that they're worthy of having anything great because they're not great in themselves in that space as a partnership. And this goes on and on and on with a whole range of stuff. I often tell, especially in the sports arena, I know couple of weeks ago I was at a junior netball game and one of the players had to play a position they hadn't played before. And before she was going on, she's like, I can't do this. I'm going to be terrible at this. And I just stopped her. I was scoring. It's not even my child. And I stopped her on the way. I went, stop. Don't tell your brain that because it's going to believe it. And she kind of looked at me like I was a bit of a weirdo. That's all right. And she got on the court and I think she went into a shooter role and she ended up getting a goal, right? And she came off and she looked at me. I said, I just did the whole head raise. I went, what did I say? She just smiled at me and kept walking, right? So she continued to tell herself, I'm not going to get this goal. I'm not going to get this goal. I'm not going to get this goal. The chances are is she won't because the brain would go, okay, well, let's not make all of this work together. Let's not get the coordination because we're not going to get this goal, right? And that gives people permission not to try at things because of fear of failure, etc. But the brain is still believing that falsehood. And this happens to external things that are shared with it as well, external untruths, external lies that are told. If they're told long enough, we start questioning ourselves of, oh, maybe that is true on a conscious level, or on a subconscious level, we just take it as true. And so what's really fascinating is long before the whole neuroscience thing existed, there were many spiritual traditions, right, that were observing exactly these same things that I've been talking about, but they didn't have the science backing for them. So if you look at, for example, Buddhism, the Buddha taught that where attention goes, attachment follows, right? And to where attention goes, energy flows. And so Master Choe Sui often taught that energy follows thought. So this is like different traditions and different language, yet they all point towards something that's really similar, right? So where we repeatedly place our attention, something grows. And modern psychology might describe it as strengthening the neural pathways, right? As we talked about before, neuroplasticity of moving that space around. But healing traditions describe it as directing energy. So whether you have a connection with energy and you understand that literally, or whether it's something symbolic that you look at or spiritually, whatever it is, the practical lesson is consistent across both science in psychology and in the energy. Attention is creative. We will create whatever we put our attention to in our lives. And that then led me to how we curate the life around us and how we influence the life around us. So we are consciously making decisions that can have outcomes, sometimes without even having critical thinking about why we're making those decisions, right? So every click that you click on a post is a vote. So let's use the word vote here. Every conversation is a vote. Every person you follow or support or purchase from or share or showcase, that's a vote. And so when I'm saying vote, what I'm talking about here is you're constantly voting for the kind of brain you're building and the kind of reality you're creating. And also that nervous system. What nervous system are you strengthening? How is your nervous system being set up by that as well? And then when all those things come together, then that results in the kind of energy that we're carrying in the world. So what kind of energy do you want to carry in the world? Is it of all of this hate and misinformation and uncoolness, or is it of kindness and compassion and community, right? So, most of us think, if we're thinking elections in Australia, it's, every 4 years, I'm pretty sure. But it doesn't happen every 4 years, right? Because what we're thinking of now, we're voting on for ourselves. And we do that every minute of every day. And what we feed is what creates power within us. So if attention is that powerful, then maybe we could be asking ourselves, instead of what am I watching, perhaps what's watching me back? What am I watching here in turn that creates what my brain is actually enforcing in there? And what is shaping my beliefs? Another thing of, an element called cognitive dissonance is when we actually believe in something, or when we actually are doing something that contradicts our beliefs, the brain gets into a bit of a frizzle and it'll double down on what we're doing, right? So that it doesn't feel like it's going against its own values or its own morals and things like that. And so sometimes when we take an action, even though, say, we vote for someone or we click and share a post of someone, if someone else brings up information that says, oh, they're not really a cool person, our brain doesn't want to think that we've supported someone that isn't cool. So it will double down on defending that person, even though they're not worth defending. And this, again, is another psychological element. People don't even realize they're doing it. So when you're making these decisions, when you're clicking on things, sharing things, engaging with the world, having conversations, how is that then, shaping your belief system and your beliefs? How is it shaping your emotional state or nervous system? How will that then come through and affect maybe your relationships or even your capacity for compassion? Because the truth of it really is every piece of content that you consume, whether it be in conversation, a newspaper article, news on the TV, social media posts, etc., it leaves something behind in your brain. And some of those things leave us feeling hopeful, others leave us feeling fearful. Some make us more curious and we want to dive deeper and we want to learn more, or we might see something and go, that doesn't seem right, so we get creative or critical in our thinking and we start researching and finding out and fact checking that information, because algorithms don't fact check either. What goes out, if it's getting clicks, it gets shared more. So some might make us curious, some of the things we can consume may make us more judgmental. But over time, even though we don't realize it, that all sits in our subconscious, and those tiny little moments then become our habits. That becomes then, those habits then become the pathways that we set up in our brain, and then that comes out in our personality, right? In who we are. That's where it's showcased. And so in the last episode, when I was talking about representation and stuff like that, I was asking you to look at who are you, what are you supporting in the form of representation? But today, it's a little bit of a shift on that to actually have a look internally, pay attention to yourself, and by the way that you're looking at the representation, by the through the people that you're supporting and the messages you're supporting and sharing and clicking and engaging with, pay attention to that, right? And pay attention to your attention. So what's capturing your attention? Is it something that is uplifting and a good news story and is invoking compassion within you? Or is your attention being captured by a emotional trigger line, something that is designed to make you dislike or have hate towards someone who doesn't look like you? Is it trying to capture an emotional response? Looking what drains it. What drains you with what you've got attention to? When you see those posts and after you read them, engage them, do whatever, how do you feel about that afterwards? And then also expands you in the content that you're consuming. And looking at the things that expand you are obviously the things that you probably should be giving more attention to, because where your attention goes, your life is going to follow, even if it's quietly on a subconscious level and you don't notice it as it's happening. So every thought, every click, every conversation, every moment of awareness that you have, they're all shaping the person you're becoming. And so maybe the most important representation in your life isn't really what's on your screen at all. It's the version of yourself that you're creating. And the version of yourself that you're creating, one moment of attention at a time. Anyway, I hope you have get some value out of this episode, and I look forward to serving you again in our next episode.